Welcome to the PyBites poetry training. Finally, one dependency and packaging manager. Well, of course, there are more, but recently we have started using poetry and we're pretty happy with it. So we designed this training to give a quick run through and hopefully by the end of it, you are ready to use it and maybe stick with it as well, because it's a really great tool. So to get the tool, you can just do a curl command to this URL. In Windows, you have an equivalent. I use Mac. I already have it installed. And to update it with the newer version, you can do a poetry self update. So basic usage, and this is one of the greatest features, is that with the poetry new command, you can make a new project and it creates the whole folder structure for you. So most of you have been in import hell at some point. Poetry kind of prevents that by putting the things in the right place, making init files that makes the directories packages, and it wires it all together. So let's actually demo that. So I'm in my code folder, and if I do poetry new, say project 1, it created the package project 1 in project 1 folder. So I can go into project 1 and do a tree, and I got a README, I got a project 1 package, the TOML file, which we'll look at next. That's kind of where poetry holds all the metadata. So what with the classic virtual environments would be requirements.txt and some more stuff. And a test folder also with an init file, making it a package, and already a test skeleton file. So at this point, I can just start writing my code. For example, it doesn't decide what module I'm going to use, so that's up to me. So let's just call it script for now. And I can also open the test file. So it already imports the init file, which has a version dunder and a test that version dunder. So actually I can run PyTest already because PyTest is already installed as part of this new project creation. And we will install more dependencies in a minute. Now to run PyTest, if I would do PyTest, it will take my global one. To run the specific one to this project, I do poetry run PyTest. And that actually detects that I don't have a virtual environment yet, and it creates it automatically in a .venv folder. And that test that was already provided by poetry runs fine. And I can add my script, my function here. And it's a hello function that receives a name. If name is not none, it's name. And if name is none, it's not given a default to stranger. And then I run return a hello name. And then I can import it here from project 1, which is the package. Script is the module. I can import hello. And I can write, well, let's get rid of this for a sec. I can make 2 tests, assert hello without anything should be equal to hello stranger, and hello with a name should equal hello name. I can run PyTest again, and that works. So usually to get to this point, I don't need this anymore. Here, people get a lot of confusion with imports. So poetry all wires it together. So that's really nice. So as mentioned before, we have a pyproject.toml file, which holds all the metadata of the project. So you have the name, the version, description, the authors. And when we push it to PyPI in a bit, that metadata is actually going to show up on PyPI. Now the dependencies, at least Python, you can add dependencies, which we'll do in a sec. And it already ships with PyTest, as we saw. So to add dependencies, you don't need to use pip. You can just do poetry add dependency. And you can specify a specific version with the caret. You can also add it from GitHub. You can remove dependencies, and to add dev dependencies, you can use the --dev or --D. So back to my terminal, we can poetry add requests. And it will install it as well as the dependencies that package requires. And then the TOML file gets updated with request, and it's showing the version it installed. And caret here means this version or greater. You also see this log file, which is actually the more specific metadata file with all the dependencies, and the dependencies of the dependencies locked down to specific versions. So if somebody would come in and do a poetry install, which I will show you on another repo in a minute, then it will use that log file to get the other developer the exact same environment. Oh yeah, and to add a dev dependency, we can do, what was it, conv? Cannot find that one. Oh, because I made a typo. And that now gets added to the developer dependencies. Let's move on. So there's some syntax to specify specific versions. So you have the caret, the tilde, and the star. And in the documentation, you see what the specific ranges are if you do that. So that's useful to know. Yeah, and the other option, of course, is like I started a new project, but what if you already have an existing project? You can actually use poetry install, and it will use the TOML and log files to set that up. So let's demo that now. So let me go out of this project and make a copy. I already have it, so I'm going to make a copy. And this project comes with a TOML file. Two TOML files, actually. And here you have all the metadata of the project. So here are all the dependencies pinned down and the developer dependencies. So I can do a poetry install, and it gets me up and running with this project. So again, it makes a virtual environment automatically for me and installs all the dependencies. And then I can run the test, but it might not work because I need some environment variables. Yeah, so if I set the required environment variables, we should just be able to run the tests. And another project we recently added was Bite Me, which Will made in our PDM program. Same story, uses poetry. You can just git clone this repository and run a poetry install. Back to the slides. So as mentioned, the virtual environment, you don't have to do that manually. Poetry will do that all in the background. But if you explicitly want to get into the virtual environment, you can use the poetry shell. Also, as mentioned, the log file, that's where the dependency resolution happens. That's how poetry can make an exact duplicate of your environment on another machine, so for another developer. And obviously, you want to commit that to version control. Yeah, here a bit about the imports. So again, import hell not only does Poetry turns those directories into packages, adding init files, done their init files, it also installs the project into editable mode, which prevents a lot of those import issues we usually see if we set up projects manually. We can define entry points. So that's really cool. You can make an alias so that you can do Poetry run alias name. And you can do that under tool Poetry scripts. And how it works is you set it to the package, the module, and then colon the function. So here you would have a Poetry directory. You would have a console.py file in this example here, and you would have a run function in that module. And I can demo that because I did that recently on a project. So back to my terminal. So I got emoji searcher. I got a TOML file. And I got an entry script or an alias I called emo. And it's pointing to emoji searcher, which is the package. The script is the module and the main is the function. So if I open that, it's pointing to the main, which is the entry of my script. So now I can run Poetry run and notice that I don't have to deactivate any virtual environment, enable another one. Poetry just knows from being in this directory that it has to work with this project. And that just works. So let's get a heart emoji, 130, and it copied the heart back to my clipboard, which if I do Control V, that works. So that was kind of that little tool. So those are entry points. To upload a project to PyPI, that's interesting. So there's quite some good documentation on how to do that manually. So you would create your package files. Actually, now it's talking about the TOML file as well. So that's it's all modern stuff. You would have to write your setup.py. You need to install setup tools. You need to install, well, you have to make the build. You build the package, and you need to also install Twine to actually get it up to PyPI. So there are quite some steps, but if you go through this, it's well documented. But Poetry, as usually, makes that quite easy. You can just run Poetry build. That will create the files in the sdist folder, which you want to ignore from version control. So you would add this folder to the .git ignore. And then you can do a Poetry publish to push it up to PyPI. And there's a nuance there that you have to kind of, you probably want to do a test run. So I had to add the test PyPI to my repositories. And you can also add your own repositories, your private ones, with its Poetry config command. So you could push, you could use publish to push things elsewhere, not to the official PyPI. So let's demo that on an existing package. Let's stick with emoji searcher for now. I think I already have a few versions generated. So let's assume we made some changes and I bumped the version, because if I now do a Poetry build, it's actually going to generate the same version I already uploaded to the test PyPI. So let's bump the version. And there are versioneer or there are tools for this, but let's do it manually for now. If I now do a build, Poetry picks up that new version from the TOML file. So now I have 0.4 in my dist folder, and I can do a Poetry publish, but I want to publish it to the test PyPI first, because I first want to make sure it looks good. Done. It should be up there. So if I go to a browser here, this was just uploaded now. And notice how it picks the metadata from the TOML file. So we have, I added some more fields in there, which go beyond the things that Poetry gives you when it makes a new project. So I also added the license, the README, or a link to the README, a relative link, homepage repository, and keywords. And especially that README is nice. That's going here, markdown verbatimly, but also generates those links. The author is a mail-to attribute, so it would trigger an email client to open. So this is really cool. So when this looks fine, I can then do the live thing by not doing -r, which defaults to the real deal, the real PyPI. So now my package is actually on PyPI, which is pretty awesome. I'm not sure if it's indexed so fast, but let's search for it. Well, there you go. Here it is. So my package is now on PyPI. Isn't that amazing? So yeah, that makes it a lot easier. Now, normally you would be asked for a password, username and password. So you can use a .py PIRC in your home folder. That though didn't work with Poetry. So what I ended up doing is to, well, first of all, define PyPI and test PyPI in my config.toml. And this was actually not here. This is for Mac. This is under, well, if I can remember correctly, in your home folder, you have a library file directory, and it should be under application support, PyPoetry, and you have the config toml and the auth toml. So the config toml, I just added that extra test PyPI repository URL. And in the auth toml, which I cannot show in video, is my token and password, or username and password, to both the test PyPI and the live PyPI, as you can see here. So that's under Python Poetry issues 111. So if you set it there, then you're not asked for a username and password every time you upload something to PyPI. Of course, totally optional. If you don't do it, you're just asked for the authentication, and it should work as well. So that's really amazing, and a very easy way to get stuff onto PyPI. No twine, no setup tools, it's all automated. So really nice. Yeah, so the .py_PIRC wouldn't work here, but apart from the auth.toml file I mentioned, you can also export these environment variables on the right to get this working. If you still need a requirements file, maybe for deployment to Heroku, you can use Poetry export, like here, and you can still generate that requirements.txt file from the toml file. Oh, and then the Python version thing, which is also important. So currently I have multiple versions installed. And I can also use the use switch to switch to another version of Python. So I can use Python 3.8, I think. Right, and that fails because I'm doing this inside a Poetry managed project, which toml file dictates that I have to be on Python 3.9 or greater. So if I just quickly change this temporarily, or I just move outside of this project, then it should actually work. Doesn't work because it does need a toml file reference. So let's switch back. I updated the toml to except 3.8 or greater. So now it made a virtual environment with 3.8. And that's how I switch Python versions inside a project. So conclusion, Poetry is a great tool. It really helps you manage project dependency, virtual environments, makes it easier to upload to PyPI. So I almost use it for anything. Now I have to say it's yet another tool. If something changes, it might break. Hopefully that won't happen. So going with the standard virtual environment, so Python -m venv, and then install dependencies with pip and make a setup file for pushing to PyPI, that's perfectly fine. It's still pretty straightforward and a robust tool. But yeah, Poetry takes a lot of decisions out of the equation. So I highly recommend studying up on this tool and use it in your day-to-day. And lastly, if you like this training or you have additional questions or you use it, you get stuck, or you just want to share with me that it's actually saving you time and making your life happier, then reach out to me on our community, on our Slack, on our PyBites Slack. It's at pybite.es/community. And I'm PyBob there. So feel free to hit me up and tell me what you think and what you have done with this training. All right. Hope this was useful, and see you in the next training. Thanks.